Hi there. Today I'm just looking at a wine that's a slightly different wine from Marlborough to what one normally sees. This is Whare Ra's Toru. It's the 2019 vintage of that. And I know it says TWR, but in the Maori language, evidently if you write a WH, that's pronounced as an F, so Whare Ra. Toru, also a Maori word meaning three, because the wine's made from three grape varieties. It's a blend of Gewürztraminer, Riesling and Pinot Gris. It's what I suppose in Alsace in the olden days they'd have called an Edelswecker, so a blend of noble grape varieties. And following the traditions of Edelswecker, although they don't have to be, they're very often field blends, and this is a field blend as well. So quite an interesting wine from that point of view. Whare Ra, one of the earlier wineries started in Marlborough. Their vineyards, their home block, which this comes off, was planted in 1979, which for Marlborough is relatively early. Since 2003, Whare Ra has been owned and run by Anna and Jason Flowerday, and they're pretty vocal advocates for organic wines, and they're certified as organic, and I believe quite a few of their practices are biodynamic as well. And they're making their wines in small batches. I mean, this was a particularly small vintage. I believe they made possibly less than 600 cases of this wine, so it's not a large production wine at all. So 2019, as I've just said, quite a small vintage. Evidently they had problems at the beginning of the season during flowering and fruit set, where it was cold, it was wet, so they got quite a small yield setting, and then when it got to the other end of the end of the season, things had flipped completely and they had a drought. So the small vintage was ripening in warm conditions. There wasn't much water available, so they got a crop of small concentrated berries. And the practices with this, as I say, was a field blend, but a lot of selection, so hand-picked, hand-sorted in the vineyard, lightly crushed and then left to do some skin contact before fermentation. Fermentation and aging going on in stainless steel tanks, and I believe perhaps a little lees aging at the end there, but and the wine's been left with a tiny touch of sugar as well. The stats say that's got 7 grams per litre in there. And I do find, as a wine, actually, this, when on release, it really needs a couple of years just to open up for the fruit to really express itself and to meld and combine quite well. As far as the wine is concerned, we're looking at a wine that should give us a fair amount of body and should work really quite well with food. So let's see if that bears that out. The colour, I'm almost saying it's a greenish yellow, but I wonder if there's almost wonder if there's any yellow note in there at all. It's almost a water white to green, pretty pale, not particularly showing a lot of heavy tears. It's 13% alcohol. It's not particularly sweet, so I'm not expecting it to be necessarily very viscous for that reason. So let's look at the aromas. The aromas are quite complex. They're relatively intense. They're not huge, but they do have a presence, and they start off being limey. So there's a freshness and almost a sort of a blossomy note as well. Behind that, there's a rich, ripe pear sort of note, almost with a sort of a green touch of pear skin on it as well. There also, I think there's a hint of sort of slightly creaminess, and then at the end there's a dusting of sweet spices, very attractive, cinnamon sort of thing. Yeah, so there's plenty going on in there on the nose. So let's have a taste. The first thing you notice is the wine has phenolic grip. Again, like a really ripe pear, you can get that sort of slightly grainy note to the texture in there, and that's what you're getting with some tannins, and that's, I think, why they've left the 7 grams of sugar in there, because it's not particularly very sweet, but there's just enough to stop the tannins seeming astringent. There's a slightly oily texture, which is also helping to smooth out the tannins. There's a tiny touch of creaminess as well, and those spices are across the back palate again. The fruit starts off as the pear that you see on the nose, and then goes off into a more of a sort of a ripe, juicy, lychee sort of note, and finishes off more as a sort of a Turkish delight with sort of rose petal notes. Above the top of that, there are touches of blossom, almond blossom perhaps. So there's plenty going on the palate. There's enough freshness to keep the fruit lively to the end. The finish is rounded. As I say, there's 13% alcohol. There's a tannic note, and okay, the Riesling will add good acidity, but I suppose the Pinot Gris and the Gewürztraminer don't, and they're adding that sort of slightly oily note. So there's a reasonable weight to the mid palate, and that carries on more to the finish, where yes, there are spicy notes and blossom notes, but there isn't a sort of a lifted fruit to the finish. It's more sort of rounded and full. Because of the wine's texture, I think this would make a very nice combination with sort of salads with cold meats and that sort of thing. Yeah, that little bit of grip would work nicely with that. There's plenty of fruit intensity. The flavours are actually lasting for a nice amount of time. So yeah, an interesting wine, a different style of wine, not the sort of thing you come across very often, and I think really rather super. The other thing I forgot to mention was that as far as the winemaking is concerned, the wine isn't fined, and therefore it's completely suitable for vegetarians and vegans as well. So thank you very much for watching. Do watch again. Bye now.